Welcome to Seminar Sunday, District 21's weekly episodic webinar series. Today we're covering the topic of chairing a speech contest. This is specifically focused on chairing a speech contest in your local Toastmasters club. However, many of these ideas could be applied to leading a speech contest at the area, division, district level, or potentially beyond. Thank you for joining us for this very special edition. It is part of a weekly series. Next week, we'll be talking about letting the world know about your club. And following that, we have many great topics coming up, including an additional topic on speech contests, specifically on chief judging, which will be on February 3rd, and lots more information. Thanks again for tuning in. Let's get kicking off here. Now, we do like to make this somewhat informal, so please feel free to take advantage of the chat to the left-hand side of your screen if you're joining us on a computer, and at the top you'll also have an option to submit a question. This webinar is going to cover a number of topics. I put them up on the screen for those of you joining on the computer, including what is the contest chair role, what you need to do prior to the briefing, during, and after the contests, and finally, we'll do some reflection on common errors when running a speech contest. So all of these very important components to running a successful speech contest. All of this we will magically navigate through in time to finish by 8 o'clock this evening Pacific time. So let's start off with what is a contest chair? Well, the contest chair doesn't necessarily reflect the person that is at the front of the room speaking. That is sometimes a misconception when people first hear about a speech contest. Instead, the contest chair is the person that's organizing things behind the scenes and really ultimately has responsibility for the success of the of the contest. Perhaps as an example, at the area contest, the area director may be the contest chair, but they may elect for someone else to be the Toastmaster of the evening and lead through the events. Now, usually it's very common for the contest chair to kick off the meeting and perhaps introduce the Toastmaster. This isn't specifically called out in the rule book, so it's not a requirement per se. But it is nice for the contest chair to somehow be involved in a speaking role as well, even if it's just for a few moments at the start and end of the contest. So again, this person is responsible for the success of the speech contest, and therefore it's someone that will do a lot of legwork in advance of the contest. They'll be there at the contest, and hopefully they'll make sure that the duties after the contest are wrapped up as well, because even though the speech contest is done, there sometimes is some outstanding items. Now, I'll be assuming through this webinar that you are just running this in your regular club meeting and not going and making it a big event, but that certainly is an option for you. You could take your speech contest and make it a public event, particularly with Toastmasters Month, which we talked about last Seminar Sunday. You could make it a big public event, big deal of it, get people from the general public into your meeting if you are an open club that welcomes members of the general public, and use that as a recruitment tool. And of course, if you're in a corporate environment, even better, you could make it a showcase of the best speakers in your club, in the sense of, here's a speech contest, come see what we're all about, put out some goodies, and make it an event that people don't want to miss. It also helps recognize, of course, the contestants, all the work they're putting into their speech, so it's worthy of an audience beyond just the members of the club. So just some thoughts there. So prior to the contest, what do you need to do? And this is, from my perspective at least, probably the most legwork you will do officially wearing that contest chair hat. I say that because, of course, during the contest, if you decide to be the person facilitating the overall contest, you are still, that's relatively high impact, but also that's an area where you are almost doing two roles. You've got your contest chair role, and then you've got your Toastmaster role that you happen to be also taking on. But prior to the contest, there's a few things that you can do. And I'll put a list here on the screen, but I don't just want to read from the list necessarily. Let's instead kind of dive into these individually one by one on what is important. So, of course, building a team is the first thing I listed because that really is critical to the success of any contest. There is so many roles to fill, but it's also important to understand what role needs to be filled. For example, the contest chair is likely going to recruit a chief judge, but they may not necessarily be recruiting many other positions. I've got a list down below of some of the other things. For example, a calligrapher shows up, a test speaker shows up for the evaluation speech contest. Contestants also shows in the list, but those are not necessarily, a lot of work to gather those people together. What is more cumbersome, perhaps, is getting that official team built. All the judges, the timers, the sergeant at arms, the ballot counters. Those folks are usually recruited by the chief judge. But of course, that requires good communication between you and the chief judge to make sure that nothing falls through the loops and one person thinks the other is taking on the bulk of that work. Mentor is important if it is your first time. I mean, if you've done it a number of times, then you're probably familiar with it. You may get rusty. We all get rusty. I personally feel a little rusty, and I'm looking forward to contest season when, you just kind of pick it up, almost like riding a bike, right? The first time you're a little wobbly. After that, it starts to get better if you've been on a bike before. Preparing paperwork in advance is another thing that I put in the list. And that goes beyond simply printing it all off and taking it to the contest. You can go above and beyond here, and it makes it easy for you as well when you're facilitating the contest or getting ready just before a contest starts. Quite often, I walk into a speech contest and the same thing is happening at every single level. And this is the vast majority of contests where people, the contestants are filling out their speech contest profiles and they're signing off their eligibility. Things like that can be done well in advance. And why not? If you consent, if you know that these members are participating in the week prior, you can have them fill out the paperwork. You could email it to them and get them to bring it to the contest. All of this saves valuable time prior to the kickoff of your meeting, because I find that 99% of times when a speech contest starts late, it's because things haven't really been organized and everybody's kind of scrambling for the paperwork to be prepared. So that is a big component, and one real quick win, I'm going to call it, in getting yourself ready for a speech contest is having all of that paperwork completed. So that would be the profile, the contestant certification of originality and eligibility, even certificates. Quite often when I'm facilitating a speech contest, I will actually print first of all the contestant certificates, no question about that, because I know who's signed up. But also, depending on how much paper I have, I, from time to time, have created a certificate for each scenario that's possible. Now, I wouldn't do this in a large contest because that would be a large waste of paper. But if there's just a small number of contestants, it's relatively easy to do that. Or you just print it out in a way that the document just needs a name put on it. So you've got your signature on it, you have the date, all the other details that are important on the certificate are ready to go. And then you either have somebody the calligrapher that is, write in the name of the winner, second place, and third place. Or I've even seen people use labels. They've got labels with each person's name on it, and then they can just affix the label. It's a clear label, so it actually looks quite nice and just takes seconds then to get your certificates ready to go. Reading through the rule book is also important. There is some changes every single year to the rule book, and the rule book is absolutely what we must follow exclusively. No exceptions to that whatsoever. And why that's so important is a couple of things. Number one is the rule book is all about running a fair contest. And number two, and perhaps even more importantly, if you have somebody from your club win the speech contest and then it's later determined that they either, maybe they weren't eligible or somehow the rules have been broken, we're risking that person being disqualified from the contest. Now, can you imagine, for example, somebody competes in your club contest, they win, and they keep going, they keep winning. And here they are potentially about to go on stage at the World Championship of Public Speaking. There's going to be 6 contestants actually starting this year for that coveted prize. And then they find out just moments before they walk on stage, they've been disqualified. That can happen. And that's a scary thought. And that's obviously a very extreme example. It's unlikely they would make it to that exact point before finding out they're disqualified. But it is a possibility, and that's why it's so important to make sure we're observing the rules. As an example, I was recently at a division event in one of our divisions here in District 21. The members were asking if someone could, for the international speech contest, complete 4 speeches in the Competent Communicator Manual and 1 path in Pathways to be eligible. Now, the rule book is very clear here. They must have either completed 6 speeches in the Competent Communicator Manual or 2 levels in Pathways. So there's no room for interpretation there. You can't possibly say, well, all right, we'll just let them go with 4 speeches and a path because that equals approximately the same number of speeches. That's not at all what the rule book says. So we have to honor it essentially to the letter in order to make sure that disqualifications don't happen or we put an unfair advantage to certain members as a result of them breaking the rules. I also listed on here the interview questions because I think that's another advantage to having the paperwork prepared in advance. If you get the speech contestant profiles back to you, especially if it's a week in advance, then you should have ample time in that week prior to the contest to actually consider what questions you may ask each contestant. It may simply be something from their profile. There could be a number of questions you ask them. But usually the basis of those questions comes from how they respond to some of the questions on the profile. So having that in advance gives you the upper hand there because you can be a little more prepared, which of course will make your presentation abilities a little more crisp through the speech contest. It is 100% possible to come up with those, on the fly. You can have the profile in front of you as you interview the contestants, but it just seems a little more choppy then and potentially just a little less smooth for the audience watching the speech contest. And finally, the last thing I had on here was verifying your space. It is very important to make sure that the meeting space you intend to use is available, but also, and this is why this is highlighted here, also make sure that there is extra space for 2 things. Number 1 is contestants in the case of the evaluation or table topics contest, where they physically need to leave the room to avoid overhearing other presentations. And number 2 is it's a space for the chief judge to go with the ballot counters in order to count and figure out who the winners of the speech contest are before coming back. So both of those should be outside, of course, of the meeting space. And if possible, well, not just if possible, it's really important actually, out of earshot. In particular, for those contestants that shouldn't be hearing in on other contestants speaking. That can be a real challenge. So all the more reason to verify what kind of space you have available to you. Sometimes it's possible, if you have a small space, to send them outdoors to wait. But of course, certain times of the year, that may not work as effectively. And with speech contests coming up in February, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly not likely to be the best time of year to have somebody waiting outside for their spot. And if you have 8 contestants and they're waiting for 7 other people to go in front of them, they're going to be very cold, and that's also going to affect their performance in the delivery and also probably make them quite upset. Any contests, any ideas rather on how you can prepare for a contest, or something that you do perhaps that's not listed? Love hearing other ideas. I mean, these are things that I've put together, but I know that the general population of members have great ideas in mass. Okay, well, perhaps I'll carry along. If you do have thoughts, though, don't hesitate to type them in and share them. We'd love to hear your ideas throughout this webinar. And like I said, a lot of you do have experience in creating or presenting speech contests. And I just love being able to interject with some of your great ideas. Thanks, Jim, for your question. And I was going to touch on this uncommon mistakes as well, because there is a misconception out there. So Jim's specific question is, to compete, people need to be at level 2 in pathways or complete 2 paths. Now, this is once again going back to taking the rule book at face value. It specifically states 6 speeches in the competent communicator or 2 levels in pathways. Why I'm emphasizing how it says 2 levels in pathways is because there is a common misconception I often overhear that it must be a level 2 in pathways. It is not. It is simply 2 levels. So if someone in your club, for example, brand new member, and they were super keen, they jumped into 2 different paths at the same time, and they complete both of their level 1s, they qualify because they have completed 2 levels. Even though they haven't moved past level 1, because they did 2 level 1s, they qualify as having completed 2 levels. So thanks for the question, Jim. That is really important to emphasize to anyone you're talking to about speech contests, to make sure people don't get told that they're not eligible to compete under the wrong understanding. That's really unfortunate when things like that happen. Brenna mentions in the question and answer section here that she has an Excel spreadsheet with contact info for all roles and a to-do list. That's a really good idea, putting a spreadsheet together. I'd love to see the template you have as well, if you don't mind sharing with me. And perhaps if we could share a template with others on the line, that would be great as well, if you're comfortable with that. Because you know, there's some great to-do lists and that type of thing around the internet, but you know, it's always neat to see other takes on to-do lists and other perspectives. Lots of great ideas that come out of those, and it's nice to be able to check off kind of, here's what I need to do, little tick list, and keep yourself on track, because you know, we all live busy lives, and I'm sure you would agree with me that speech contests are probably not your #1 priority in your day-to-day life. You enjoy them, at least I'm making that assumption, because you've joined this webinar, you enjoy a speech contest, you want to run a good speech contest, but there's other things going on in life, whether that be, you know, work or family or whatever it happens to be. There's other things in life that distract us from speech contests, and any checklist that you can take is really effective. Sean has mentioned a couple of things here. So prepare for introduction of dignitaries. That is also important, and I specifically didn't include it in this session because it's less likely, and I mean that not in a impossible. It is slightly less likely you're going to have a lot of dignitaries at a club speech contest, but it is possible. The district director could show up, or you could have your area director there. And particularly if any dignitary has arrived, it is important to recognize them and give them the proper introduction. So if anybody ever needed support with that, I feel very comfortable sharing anything that people need about protocol, because when it does get mistaken or incorrectly performed, then unfortunately it takes a little bit away from the effort that is being made to recognize those folks. So a good example that I can think of is you would introduce a current serving officer at any level before a past leader at any level. And quite often I'll go to a speech contest in Victoria, for example, and we are fortunate enough to have past international president Pat Johnson in our membership here locally. So she attends some of the speech contests, an amazing leader from our organization, but she is a past international president, and therefore she would fall in the introduction order after anybody that's currently sitting. So you would introduce anybody at the international level, and then anybody at the district level, and then Pat. It's quite often though that she will get introduced first. It's great. It's they're trying to be very respectful and recognize that, hey, what, you went to the international level, and maybe some other people in the room went to just district level, or whatever the perspective happens to be. But it's just so important to recognize those currently serving, because they're currently putting in the effort before somebody that's served previously. So just little things like that sometimes get missed, and also introducing them properly. So you introduce them with their designation and then their role, designation, name. So you would not short form to say, our district director, Sean Gold, DTM. You would say our district director, distinguished Toastmaster, Sean Gold, and then lead the clapping. But please reach out to me. That could almost be a whole separate session. Protocol is a fun topic to cover off. We don't have one of those, I don't think, for Seminar Sundays, so I'm happy to personally support if anybody had questions there. And finally, make sure the contestants know when and where the next level contest is at. I think that is really important. Any other thoughts whatsoever? Jim, I appreciate your question. The question, just for those of you that aren't looking at the chat right now, is if you haven't seen a contest before at your club, should you get a coach? I do recommend having some sort of mentor, and it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody with vast amounts of experience. You could attempt it yourself, but it's just nice to have somebody there to kind of walk you through the path. The great thing with these contest materials, and something I did forget to have in tonight's presentation, is the fact that you can go to the Toastmasters.org website and you can download all the contest materials. So you just go to the shop there, you search for either international or evaluation speech contest, or if your club wants to do, there's also table topics, humorous, and tall tales contests. You download the file, and there's PDFs with all the paperwork you need, contest rule book, essentially everything you need to go. But of course, and there's also scripts available, not from Toastmasters.org, but from Google. You can find some great things out there for scripts on how to run the contest. But just because there's so many little idiosyncrasies with a contest, I would recommend getting somebody to support you that perhaps has served in some sort of contest capacity previously. So I'm going to move along now to the briefing. And this is another key part of the contest experience. There's really three things that I pocketed into this section. Number one is drawing the speaking order. Number two, reviewing rules. And number three is the speaking area. So I'll start with the rules, just because this evening I haven't necessarily been going in the order that it displays on the screen. that's a high level overview of, all right, folks, for example, you've entered the international speech contest. Here's the rules. Your speech needs to be 5 to 7 minutes. You must speak at least 4.5 minutes, and you cannot speak more than 7.5 minutes, or you'll be disqualified. The timing lights will show green at 5, yellow at 6, red at 7, and just kind of go through all of that. Let them know that photographs are not allowed. If they want to video record, they need to get permission from you as the contestant, as well as from you as the contest chair. Anything that is relevant, you go over the originality, eligibility, make sure everybody's aware of the basic rules for the speech contest they're entering, because the last thing you want is for someone to be unaware and they do a 10-minute speech that's incredible, and of course perhaps from the judge's standpoint, maybe they were the best contestant, but that timer's confirmation of the time is going to show that actually they get disqualified for time, and then they're upset because maybe they weren't informed, for example. So really important to cover that off in the briefing, things like the timing and the eligibility and the fact that they need to have an original speech. It can't just be a ripoff from the internet or wherever else. But why I kind of called out the speaking order and the speaking area separately from the rules, because really in some ways they're part of the rules, is because I see those mistaken or left out a little too often. Specifically with the speaking order, I see a common mistake there where the contest chair will start the briefing, and let's say they had 5 contestants, but 4 contestants were there for the briefing. Well, there is a common misconception that that 5th person that's not there, they get the last spot in speaking order if they happen to show up. That is incorrect. When you draw for speaking order, no matter how you do it, you would draw for all 5 speakers. Now, the missing person, perhaps they are last, just by the way it was drawn. But they also could be first. And if they're first, then that's when, of course, they just have to be there. And as soon as you start the meeting as the contest chair, or if the Toastmaster starts the meeting, if that 5th person doesn't show up, they are not able to compete, regardless if they were speaker number 1 or speaker number 5. So that is clear in the rule books. I want to emphasize that because that's important. And finally, speaking area. The speaking area, as far as I've seen, I don't think I've ever been to a briefing where somebody has clearly defined the speaking area. And this should be explained to the contestants as well as the judges. And this is not something that you get disqualified for. Why it's important to identify the speaking area is because that's how they should be judged on the use of the stage space. A few years ago, I went to a contest where someone competing in the evaluation contest even walked out into the audience and was continuing their speech there. Now, of course, that became slightly controversial because nobody had been told about the speaking area. But of course, the other contestants just assume that, hey, the stage is where I'm supposed to stay, and probably rightfully so. Really, the contest chair should have said, hey, the speaking area is this, and the chief judge also explained the same speaking area. And then what's going to happen with the judging? Well, they're just going to mark lower for the use of the space because they used it inappropriately. So once again, not a disqualifiable rule or anything, but it's something that should be used in the judging of the speech contests. Any other things that, actually, sorry, I just remembered, as Sean mentioned earlier, there's that when and where is the next level of the contest. And I think that's another important thing to cover in the briefing, or ideally, yes, even in advance, if you're sending an email or making announcements, making those contestants aware throughout the process where they go next is important, because the the last thing we like to see is, you've got, let's go to the extreme. Let's say you had 10 contestants at your club. Good for you. Unlikely, I know, at most clubs to have 10 contestants, but let's say you did. You had 10 contestants. What if number 1 to 9 had no idea that the next level was the area contest, and they just refused to go? Well, all of a sudden you're sending your last place finisher, and maybe they're happy to go, but it's just disappointing to see that happen. So perhaps with some prior knowledge and ideally the dates of when that will be, then people are aware, this is what's next for me, should I win. It really helps them understand that this speech contest is not just something fun that our club is doing, but rather it's going to continue to the area, division, district, perhaps even beyond. Did anybody have any other ideas what you may cover in a briefing above and beyond those kind of basics? I know there's lots of different things that individuals like to cover. Thanks, Jim, for the question. And Sean, you've also put the pronunciation of names. That is really important, and something many times I'll admit I've made a mistake on that, where I've got up in front and I'm ready to go, and then I have that moment of panic when I realize that, oh my goodness, I have no idea how to say that person's name. That's happened more times than I should be admitting on this webinar. But certainly something to double check, pronunciation of names. If there's any name that seems a little bit potentially confusing to you, you might as well double check, because people appreciate the correct pronunciation of names. It's always fun to see how especially the World Championship of Public Speaking, how they pronounce some of the names, because quite often there you have such an international crowd that the names are quite different than you may be used to in your day-to-day life. Jim, you've asked here about what can be covered in speeches, or is that just Toastmasters basics expected? That is one of the things about Toastmasters, is there is no rules officially on what to talk about. Now, the most common speech you will see when you get to the upper levels of the international speech contest, for example, is very motivational speeches, inspirational speeches, where somebody's overcome something, and they're amazing stories. But the rule book doesn't say that that is the type of speech that must be given. You could give a humorous speech. That is completely within the rule book. And same, you could do a very inappropriate, 18 plus speech if you wanted to. What's going to happen, though, is, of course, once again, the judging may get a little bit skewed. Hopefully not so much for the humorous speech as the appropriateness. Yes, that could be eroded away a little bit, but it's not completely inappropriate. But the 18 plus one in particular, that's going to hurt, because, soon there was somebody a few years ago I remember seeing they did a great speech, but they were using a lot of bathroom humor and that type of thing, and it did impact their score in the end. As much as it was a good speech, it was just not necessarily appropriate for the audience. So I don't know. Sorry, Jim, I see you're stepping away, but just short answer there. It's something that can be about any topic. Yes, Sean, thanks for reminding me as well. Timing lights, where they are, what they look like, timing rules. Yeah, we covered that already, the timing rules, but the actual location of timing lights, super critical. It is so embarrassing to get up there on the stage, and while you're doing your speech, you're your eyes are all over the place looking for where are those timing lights, trying to figure that out. So a purposeful explanation of, here are the timing lights. Here's here's exactly where you need to look when you're trying to check how you're doing for time. So I'll move on to the actual facilitation of the contest. Once again, it is not something that all contest chairs do. So I certainly don't expect that everyone that's on this call is necessarily going to jump up and be the contest Toastmaster as well. It can be the same role, doesn't have to be. Most of it, like I said, I recommend using the scripts, at least for practicing to get yourself comfortable. There is a golden rule that I like to at least suggest to people, and that is 5. 5 minutes from the time your gavel hits the lectern to start that meeting until you have your first contestant speaking. Now, if you're doing the evaluation contest only, for example, or that's going first, that would be your test speaker. But in other contests, that would be speaker number 1 being introduced. Quite often, I see in speech contests, people end up covering more than they need to. They go on for some time about this, that, and the other. And, it's not that the information is not necessarily valuable. It's just not relevant, because we have to remember, and this is another thing to think about. We must remember that every contestant is briefed by the contest chair, and every judge, timer, sergeant at arms, ballot counter is briefed by the chief judge. So the only people you're really providing information about the contest to in that audience is just the general audience who are watching only. And depending on the size of your meetings and how many people are taking on roles, that could be a relatively small group of people. They don't need to know much other than, here's what you're going to see. You're going to see the international speech contest or the evaluation contest or both or whatever. They need to be told that there's no photography. That is in the rule book, no photography. Video recording is only with approval of the contest chair and the contestant or contestants, depending who's being video recorded. And, it'd be nice to tell them the time, but they don't need to know what, for example, at 5 minutes it's going to go green. And why do they need to know the color of the lights? They shouldn't be looking at the lights. They should be looking at the speaker. So, the international speech contest will now commence. This is a series of 5 to 7 minute speeches, etc., etc. So the timing is nice for them to know. We'll see you later, Brenna. Take care. The timing is very nice to know, but it is not something that they need to know the time, how the lights are going to go. They don't need to know eligibility or originality even necessarily. I mean, you could touch very high level on it, but it's also not important because only judges and contestants can lodge a protest, and they've already been briefed. So there's really not a lot of point to let the audience know that, hey, eligibility and originality are important here, but you guys can't lodge a protest. There's other people in the room that can. Things like that just they take up time for no defined purpose. So I do recommend really considering what is the message that you need to pass on to the audience. So for me, like I said, it would be about turning phones to silent. It would be about the lack of photography. Ask people not to leave the room when contestants are speaking, or enter the room when contestants are speaking. And that's really about it. And then I'd ask the chief judge, have the officials been briefed? They give the confirmation, you give the speaking order, and away you go. Any other thoughts or things that you might add in during the contest before you start introducing contestants? Okay, well, I'll just continue on. And once again, I mean, if you're typing or anything, don't hesitate to still submit, and we can still discuss it. So through the contest, essentially, it's once you've done that kind of opening to let everybody know kind of the house rules, so to speak, you introduce the contestants with the name and speech title and the name. Do the minute of silence in between. Don't comment on the speeches. That's another thing that sometimes people feel a little awkward about, adding the silence in, and they try to add a little joke or something. You have to hold yourself back because, of course, judges are going to be marking, and you want to keep it fair. So adding in any comments is not a good idea. And then, of course, there's the interviews where you've pre-selected a couple of questions, hopefully. Now, depending on the timing that you have and the time between you starting the interviews and when the chief judge comes back, it's nice to do about maybe a minute per contestant. And if you have extra time at the end, what you could do, because I know people feel a little awkward about this, they're always worried, well, how's the timing going to line up? You could maybe have a quick promo for the area speech contest, for example, especially if the area director's there. Maybe you could say, hey, madam or Mr. Area Director, if you could come up and share with us, what is your speech contest going to look like? Or could you tell us more about the details and the location and all those things? Because maybe the contestants know, but the audience probably isn't yet aware when the area speech contest is, for example. So lots of things like that you could try to add in as well if you have the time. So that way you can keep it short and succinct if the chief judge comes back quickly. But you also have different things that you could use to extend the time a little bit if there's a delay, or, for example, if a protest is lodged, then it could take some time before you resolve it. And instead of having that awkward, okay, we're just going to stand here and wait for the chief judge to come back, instead you switch it up and make it seem like that's how you planned it. And you could even say to the area director before the start, hey, I might call you up. Just depends how things go between the last interview and the chief judge's arrival back to the room. If you do come up, if you could limit it to 1 to 2 minutes or whatever your expectation is for timing. Speaking of timing, this is another important thing. What you need to do for timing is basically you've got your 5 minutes to start, as we talked about, and then you would take the amount of maximum speaking time. In the example of an international speech contest, 7 minutes is the usual maximum, but they could go to 7:30. So assume everybody's going to speak for 7 minutes and 30 seconds, plus the introduction that they're going to do, which is probably 30 seconds, plus the minute of silence in between each speaker. So now you know that you need 9 minutes per speaker. So you can kind of do the math to say, okay, 5 minutes at the start, plus 9 times however many speakers you have. And then that's when it gets a little more complicated, because the interviews are subject to however long you make it last. And also getting back to that chief judge coming back into the room, presentation of awards, and you're done. Same exact concept with the evaluation contest, for example. 3.5 minutes is the maximum that somebody would be doing an evaluation, potentially. 30-second introduction, 1 minute for the judging. There's your timing right there. So just a rough guide how you can kind of do timing. You'll always want to leave just a little bit of extra space in that agenda in case something does kind of go a little bit sideways somewhere along and you're not pressed to the second. But I think that's a nice way to do it. So thanks, Jim, for the question. You don't have to do any speech contest officially. Now, at the club level, you could do any of the 5 official Toastmasters contests if you'd like to. The evaluation, the table topics, the tall tales, the humorous, and the international speech contest. The contests that progress beyond the club level are the evaluation speech contest and the international speech contest. So the evaluation contest is another fun contest that goes all the way from your club to the district level. The district is the final, so it does not go beyond district level. What you do is you have your test speaker get up in front of the audience. The contestants are all sitting in the audience, and they write notes during the speaker's whatever speech they happen to do. They then get 5 minutes in sequester to work on their notes and figure out what kind of evaluation they would do, and then their notes are taken away until they go to give their evaluation. And one by one, they come up and do their evaluation of the speaker. They're judged on that. And then, of course, there's also the international speech contest, which is a normal kind of 5 to 7 minute speech on whatever topic they choose. So some clubs will do one, some will do both, some may do even all 5. Totally up to the club. You can nominate people from your club as well to compete at the area level. I encourage people to do club contests because it's a great experience for the contestants. It's a fun and different meeting style than people are used to all the time. So it makes it more interesting for members. And it's just good practice for everybody to have. So highly recommend holding contests. But if you have nobody interested in one or the other, then of course you can just run one or potentially none, which would be disappointing. But there's no formal requirement to do it. I just want to make sure that's clear. I don't want people leaving this thinking that, oh, I have to do this. No, you don't have to. It's really good to do, though. And I hope you agree, Jim, and feel the same way, that this is something that would be fun for your club to do, because there's some of my favorite meetings actually when we do that, because it's just so different and it's a lot of fun to see what kind of A game the members can put on with their speeches. And you can do it in one meeting or 2 separate meetings. They are 2 separate speech contests. A lot of times we combine them together so people look at it as a speech contest, but it's 2 speech contests that we do. Yeah, I mean, Jim, I understand you're in a corporate club and there's the apathy and lack of attendance. A lot of community clubs have the same challenge, though. So, challenge the members to do it. And the great thing is, if you can convince some of them to come out and attend an area speech contest or something, they may start to see Toastmasters as more than something attached to work. And that's something that, as soon as you start to, like, I've been part of a club as well it's not officially corporate locked down to an organization, but we meet in an organization where 90% of the members are from, and it's the employer pays and everything as well, and that club has been producing leaders for a long time. So even though you're a corporate club, don't look at that as a bad thing. Look at that as an opportunity to expand and take advantage of it. And this is one of those ways: speech contests. After the contest, the main thing to do, of course, is, assuming you didn't rent a venue. If you did, then paying the bill and everything for the venue would be important. But if you are just using your regular meeting room and it's regular meeting day or night, and you just happen to run the different agenda, the main thing to do, submit this document: notification of contest winner. It's so common to see clubs not using this, and even areas not using this, but it's so important. And why I emphasize it is because you're using this as kind of an official notification. Here's your winner. And if you're looking at the screen, you'll notice there's clearly a first place, a second place, all the way down to 10th place. List them all. The biggest thing that people do is say, well, here's the winner's name, or here's the top 2's name. What if that winner or the top 2 can't make it to the next level? The area director will need to find out who's number 3, who's number 4, etc., until they find somebody willing to compete at the next level. So list all of your contestants. And of course, if you only had 2 contestants, for example, well, so be it. You list both of them. But it's just so nice to have that kind of formal documentation and get in the habit of that, because, we are kind of, in some cases, getting a little lazy with the official paperwork, and people just think, oh, well, I'll send an email with that detail. But as you move through the upper levels, I mean, if you can imagine me, for example, program quality director, I'm going to, be the contest chair for the district contest. And if I didn't use this form, if I just sent World Headquarters an email to say, well, here's our district champion, and, please consider them for the region quarterfinals, then World Headquarters is probably going to come back and say, no thanks, pal, you need to do this way. In fact, I received an instruction video how to do it for the region quarterfinals, because we actually have to send a video now to World Headquarters for them to judge. And the winners from the judged kind of video of the international speech contest move on to semifinals. But that's way beyond the club level. We're not focused on that tonight, but just an FYI. So after you've submitted that, that's kind of more or less when the role ramps down. I mean, at the end of the contest, you'll probably thank everyone for their support, but I would encourage you to go up after the contest as well and thank the chief judge and any other team members that have been involved in putting the event together. Recognition is so important. From there, the main thing I think we need to cover off before closing tonight is just common mistakes. And I listed out some of the most common things that I see, and we've kind of touched on most of them here. Commenting on a speech or using humor. So that's one thing that would not be appropriate. Somebody gets up, they do their speech, and you're like, oh, thanks, that was a great speech. There's a judge judging in the audience. You don't want to say anything about the contents of the speech, whether you liked it, whether you didn't. You don't want to try and make a joke based on their speech. You want to keep it as objective as possible and just lay down the facts. What I usually do is I tell people at the start there's going to be a minute of silence between speeches, and I just stand there quiet for a minute. But if you're going to say something, that can be about it. Just please remain silent for a minute. After the last contestant has spoken, please remain silent until all the ballots have been collected, and just move along like that. Judging. Judging is another thing that can quite often people feel has been incorrectly applied. So making sure the chief judge has their tools, whatever they need in order to help out the judging team. I would encourage the chief judge to consider some sort of judge training prior to the contest as well, if possible. It's not something that's required, but it is nice to make sure that your judges are using the official judging form and using it appropriately. A common thing, for example, the evaluation speech contest. It only has several categories, and one of them is the summation, the summary that they give at the end of their evaluation. Quite often we see people win the evaluation contest that didn't give a summary, but that's worth 15% of their overall marks. So surely that person, very unlikely, was 15% better than the next best contestant. It's just they haven't necessarily been marked correctly. It often happens, and that is across the board. There's different things. So giving people the time to review the judging form or reviewing it as a team is something that I would encourage you to insist on your chief judge, because you want the right result to come up. You want the winner to be, deserving of being the winner based on the evaluation criteria, essentially, that's set out on the judging form. Test speaker. I highlighted that because it's so common to see a test speaker that is well known. That gives certain members of your club an advantage. If possible, the test speaker should be somebody unknown. Now that's really hard in the club level, of course, because you may not have a lot of connections outside the club. But perhaps you could contact your area director and see if they know of a member of another club that would be willing to visit, if possible. Once again, I mean, these are all ideals. They're not requirements, but let's say you had two people competing in the evaluation speech contest. One person had been around your club for 20 years, the other for 20 days. The person that's been around for 20 years is probably going to know every member pretty well and has evaluated them quite a few times. But the person who's been around for 20 days doesn't necessarily have that same insight into the individual. Now, the person that has been around for 20 days could potentially do a better evaluation just based on the criteria on the judging form. But they won't be given a fair advantage if the test speaker is someone that, like I said, is well enough known that somebody knows more about that speaker than another person. Anna, I don't believe the rulebook does allow it to be a video of a speaker, and regardless, I would recommend against it just because, so many things can go with a video sideways that you wouldn't want to risk in a speech contest. So try to get a real person, real member of your club or another club. Scheduling of time, we covered that as well. That's another thing that people sometimes miss. They think that, okay, every speech is 7 minutes, forgetting to factor in that time for introduction, overage, and the minute in between. Drawing for contestants who missed the briefing. Once again, we covered that. A lot of clubs or area divisions, I even see, they get the chief judge to come up and brief the audience on the contest rules. Well, once again, I mean, maybe it's great knowledge to have, these are the rules, but it's not a requirement. And it eats up time in the speech contest away from the contestants. So I recommend against doing that. It's not necessary to let the audience know, once again, about what color the lights are going to be, or the fact that every speaker has, completed six speeches from this Competent Communicator Manual or 2 levels in pathways. Eligibility, that's another area where people misunderstand. 2 levels in pathways, not 2 paths, not level 2 levels. And finally, announcing of the winners. If you have less than 5 contestants, you will limit the amount of winners you announce at the end to make sure you're not calling out who the last place winner is. So if you had 4 people and you announced the top 3, well, who was number 4? It's obvious. So if you had 4 contestants, you name the top 2. If you have 3 contestants or fewer, you would only announce the winner and tell the person second or third privately and give them the certificate, just to make sure that we're not calling out the person that performed the least good in a speech contest. So that, in 1 hour's time, is speech contests. I would love to go on for many hours longer and dive into every topic a lot more, but I hope that you've taken some nuggets from this webinar and can use that in your speech contest. I welcome you to contact me if you've got questions directly about facilitating a speech contest at your club or area. And your area and division directors can also be a great resource. They've got great knowledge. I want to thank you very much for joining. And just remember, the main thing here is to keep the contest fair. If we work towards a fair playing field for everyone, we are always doing the right thing. Thank you all for joining. Have a great day or evening, and my contact details are on the screen. See you next week.